and welcome to Book Breaks. We are so thrilled today to welcome Dr. Edna Fields Black and her book, COMBEE, Harriet Tubman, the Combahee River Raid, and Black Freedom During the Civil War. And I'm your host, Gina Oppenheim, and I'm joined by my friend Ryan, who will be answering your questions in the second half of the program. And without further ado, here's Edna Fields Black, is a professor in the Department of History and the director of College Humanities Center at Carnegie Mellon University. Welcome, Professor Black. We're so thrilled to have you here today.
Thank you, Gina. It's good to be here. I have one tiny correction.
Yes, please.
My name is pronounced Edda.
Edda, yes, I'm sorry. Thank you.
Edna was my mother-in-law.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Thank you. And I see that right there on the screen, and that's what, live Zooms. I was trying to get the book title corrected, and
It's no problem, no problem.
thank you so much, Professor Black. And now, so just to start us off, could we please have an overview of the book? Because it's just a fantastic interpretation of a story people might not know.
Sure. So Combee is about the Combahee River Raid, which occurred on June 1st through 3rd of 1863, when Harriet Tubman, her group of spies, scouts, and pilots, piloted Colonel James Montgomery, who was the commander of the raid and the commander of the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, with the 2nd South Carolina, which were 300 Black soldiers, and one battery of the uh, Rhode Island Heavy Artillery in 3 armed gunboats up the Combahee River. They burned 7 rice plantations, completely destroyed them, and destroyed 2 rice crops, uh, burned a pontoon bridge across the Combahee River, severing a supply line of the Confederacy, exporting rice and using rice to feed their citizens as well as their military, and freed 756 people. So Combee is about this raid. This was the largest slave rebellion in U.S. history, I argue, in Combee. And of course, Harriet Tubman is the main character. And so the book is about the most detailed and best documented account of Harriet Tubman's Civil War service for the U.S. Army as a spy. Um, the other main characters are the Combee freedom seekers. And so I'm using a variety of documents, particularly the US Civil War pension files, to identify the people who were liberated in the raid and some of the soldiers who fought in the raid, and tell the story of the raid through their voices and from their perspectives. And it's not a small feat because, of course, these people were enslaved, and a variety of other documents which come from the plantation sources, the planters' sources. And lastly, the environment. The rice fields are very much a uh, main character in the book. My goal was to put the reader in the rice fields with the enslaved people. We know that they were in the rice fields at 4 a.m. on June 2nd when they first sensed the U.S. Army boats coming up the river. And so I wanted the readers to know what their lives were like, um, growing this crop and living and being forced to work in this very deadly environment, so that we know their names, we know their experiences by the time they're getting on the boat. And we have some idea what this pursuit for freedom meant to them.
Yeah, well, and the book is structured in such a unique way. I was wondering if you could tell our audience about that.
Well, the book is structured chronologically, which, believe it or not, as a historian was actually kind of hard. I didn't necessarily think chronologically before writing Cumbee, but here we go. And the first part of the book, I wanted to introduce the main characters and really wanted to paint the scene of where the raid took place. And again, the rice fields where the enslaved people were forced to live and work. And to really contrast that setting to the Maryland Eastern Shore and to the slave economy and the experiences of enslaved people in this border state, right, where freedom was so close. So, what I'm doing in the first part of the book is weaving Harriet Tubman's story around the story of the Combahee Freedom Seekers. And in the Combahee Freedom Seekers, I'm juxtaposing what we know about the enslaved people with what we know about the slaveholders. And so trying to introduce all the main characters and all the main elements. Part two is about the Port Royal experiment. So this is the time, this is the Civil War. This is when Harriet Tubman actually comes down to Beaufort, South Carolina. She arrives in May of 1862. So then I have to put all the main characters of the abolitionists who came down after the Battle of Port Royal in order to help, in quotes, the freed people from Beaufort, the Sea Islands, and Port Royal to adjust to freedom, right? And so Harriet comes down in that context. She's not one of those abolitionists, but this is the time in which she comes down in the context. So that's another sort of painting the picture of what Harriet would have seen in Beaufort, as well as some of the Combahee freedom seekers who fought in the raid and then came, well, they fought in the raid uh, and are from the plantations where the raid took place. They come to Beaufort before the raid. And then part three is the raid. So part three is the raid itself. And having introduced the main characters, you then see what happens to them and their families in the raid and the drama of the raid itself. I think the second main character of Combee is Minus Hamilton.
That was literally my next question. You read my mind.
Okay, so I'll leave Minus Hamilton. We'll talk about him in a minute. But really using his life story and the story of one of the planters, Joshua Nichols. We have these two first person accounts, which are diametrically opposed. The enslaved person and the enslaver are talking about the raid from their own perspectives. So that's sort of the core of the part three. And who actually escaped, right? The main characters and their family members who actually got on the boat. And then part four is what happens after the raid. So the men, able-bodied men aged 14 to 70, enlisted in the Second South Carolina. The women, the children, the disabled men, elderly men were taken to Old Fort Plantation in Port Royal, which was a refugee camp. And so we see the soldiers going off and fighting in other battles. We also see the community that is built on Old Fort, where the people identify themselves as Combee among this in this place where there are overlapping waves of refugees being brought in from different places in the Georgia, South Carolina, Florida region. Um, and really I'm following the main characters up until they die. And so after the war, many purchase land, and the process of gaining land and trying to hold on to land and losing land, I'm arguing is really going to be the precursor to these folks who still think of themselves as Combee becoming part of what we call today the Gullah Geechee. I talk a lot about burials. So the same veterans who grew up together and served together then bury each other. They take care of each other and their widows in their final illness, and bury each other. So really, and many, I should say, go back to the rice plantations. So they go back to the rice plantations from which they liberated themselves. And if they're not residing and working on the same plantations, they're very close by. So you see the formation of these communities in Beaufort, in Colleton County, as well as in Florida.
Yeah. And now, if you could tell us who Minus Hamilton was.
Okay. Minus Hamilton was an 88-year-old man who told his life story to Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson. And he told his story a few weeks after the raid about what he and his wife experienced on the morning of and during the Combahee River raid. And Hamilton tells it in Gullah. And Higginson, I'm sure everyone knows who he was. He was the commander of the 1st, 2nd South Carolina Volunteers. And he's in the region during the Port Royal experiment, an abolitionist from Massachusetts. And like many other abolitionists who were in the Low Country at this time, he records speeches and songs and proverbs and life stories of people he encounters. And so he records it, we can only assume the way Minus Hamilton spoke it, and Minus Hamilton spoke in Gullah. It's a phenomenal account. It's one of, believe it or not, one of the first primary sources I found long before I was thinking about Combee as a book. I was riding with Minus Hamilton, and I was completely fascinated because he tells us that the enslaved people were in the rice fields at 4 a.m. hoeing rice. He tells us how he felt, and how many times do we get to hear how an enslaved or formerly enslaved person felt, how he felt leaving his home and not being able, he was in the rice field, so he couldn't go back to the slave quarters. And the only two things that he thought were his own were two blankets, and he had to leave those behind. He talks about what's happening in the rice fields when they first sense the US gunboats coming up the river. The overseer is there, which is very unusual in June during the sickly season. The overseer tells them to go to the woods and hide, and the enslaved people ignore him and they go, he says, we're going straight to the boat. He talks about he and his wife's interaction as other people are running to the boat. People are telling them to hurry up. They're elderly, right? And his wife does some trash talking. They tell her that the Confederates are coming and she needs to hurry up. She told him to come on. They can go ahead and come on. She's going to the boat. Minus Hamilton talks about his feelings of complete and utter awe when he sees young Black men in uniform for the first time. And these are 2nd South Carolina soldiers who have come to liberate him, right? He calls them the Black soldiers so presumptuous. He just cannot even believe these young men and how they held their backs straight and held their heads up, and they came ashore and went right to the slaveholder's house and burned it to the ground, right? You can just see his awe. And lastly, he talks about, again, he's talking about the soldiers and the young people. He's grateful for the young people who came to liberate him. And he says, but the young folks can go through by force. We old people have to go slow.
Yeah. So many moments in the book that feel so cinematic, and this was so especially one of them. So anyone out there, love his made. Now, thinking of Harriet Tubman, can you share with us some things you uncovered about her that our audience might not know?
Yeah, sure. So the interesting thing about Tubman is that she talked about the Combahee Raid and she talked about her Civil War service for the rest of her life, to her biographers and interviews. Yet, and her biographers wrote about it, but the Civil War literature really ignored it. And so I set out to figure out why that was. And I think one of the main reasons was a problem of sources, that Civil War historians typically, traditionally, um, deal with the official military record. They deal, they interpret biographies, memoirs of officers and soldiers, people who were literate, people who wrote down what they saw, what they experienced at the time. Harriet Tubman was illiterate. Harriet Tubman talked about the raid and the Civil War after the fact. And so I think they were looking for independent evidence to corroborate what she said before they took it seriously. And I set out to find that evidence. And where I found it was in the papers, in the letters of abolitionists and their children whom Tubman worked with. And I talk about that in part one, whom she worked with primarily in Massachusetts after she liberated herself in 1849 and before the Civil War. And so in these letters, they talk about Tubman working in the refugee camps, gathering intelligence. They talk about Tubman um, being the captain of a group of men, and this is her group of spies, scouts, and pilots, men she recruited, trained, and led, and there were 8 or 9 of them. And some of them were like career spies for the US Army. Some were kind of hardcore, you know. Tubman was the leader of this ring of spies. And how Tubman and her spies piloted Colonel James Montgomery on his most successful mission. They talk about what the torpedoes. So, information about the torpedoes that had been planted, and when I say torpedoes I mean mines. The language that's used in the primary sources is torpedoes. Today we would think of them as landmines, um, that are planted along the Combahee River, and Tubman and her men, I infiltrating the Confederate plantations and finding the enslaved men who were forced to plant these mines, accompanying those enslaved men back to the sites where the mines were planted with the Second South Carolina commanders. And I'm assuming that it is the Third Rhode Island Heavy Artillery, because that's what they did. They blew things up, right?
Mhm.
Um, and the officers of the Second South Carolina, the officers, the U.S. Army officers, diffused and removed the torpedoes. And this opens the Combahee River up to the U.S. Army boats. And lastly, a letter about what Tubman did during the raid says that she got to burning plantations, burning buildings, and that she went to the slave quarters and told the people to come to the boat so they could go to freedom.
Mm.
Now, we know that the people who were able to work were already in the rice fields. So these would have been the elderly, the very old, the very young, the ill, and the disabled, the most vulnerable people. Tubman went to them and she went to get them and to bring them to freedom.
Amazing. Well, something else I found really interesting was these abolitionists' response to her letters. Can you tell us about that? Because it was surprising.
Well, not everybody was excited that Harriet Tubman was coming to Beaufort. And I tell you that there's a letter from a lesser known abolitionist, and many of the letters actually come from the abolitionist kids, right? So William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, Caroline Severance's sons. These were young men many of them were in college, and they left college to help to volunteer for the Port Royal experiment. I liken it to them growing up with Aunt Harriet, right? They grew up with Harriet Tubman. They grew up in the movement, and they leave school, which I'm not, advocating, but I tell my students, I'm not telling you to do anything. They leave college, they go down to Beaufort, Port Royal, the Sea Islands, and who do they encounter? Aunt Harriet. So they're very excited and they're writing home about what's happening, what Harriet Tubman is doing. So there's this one letter by James Seymour Severance, young guy who was a student at Harvard. His mother was actually very big in the abolitionist movement and in the women's movement. And he goes down to one of the Sea Islands and he's working on a plantation. And he hasn't exactly done what his mother told him to do, which is to take this letter and give it to the people and they'll give you a job. And he didn't do it. So he's kind of doing grunt work. But in doing this grunt work, one day he is privy to a conversation of one of the architects of the Port Royal experiment, who is basically complaining that Harriet Tubman is going to be sent because he wanted a man, right? He wanted a man who could teach. He wanted a man who could read. And he doesn't know why they're sending her. And so Severance basically says, well, she could do here what she did in Maryland. And the response is, no, we can't have that here, right? We're following President Lincoln. We're taking the gradual approach. And we can't have any of that Underground Railroad stuff down here. So interestingly enough, of course, Tubman comes and she ends up in downtown Beaufort working in the refugee camps, which were the front lines as freedom seekers came from Confederate controlled territory into Union occupied territory, right? Usually the first stop would be in these refugee camps where their needs would be assessed. And so Tubman is, the CIA today would say, she debriefed the freedom seekers as they came from Confederate controlled territory and found out what they knew and what they saw, and then passed that information on to the Union Army commanders.
Now, can you tell our audience your familial connection to this story? Because it's pretty amazing.
Yes, and I have to preface this by saying I did not know this. Much of it I did not know until I was far into the research and writing of Combee. So my father was the last of his siblings born a mile or two from where the raid took place. And then my grandparents migrated to Charleston and to Miami, Florida. So we still have a lot of family in South Carolina, in Colleton County. And to our knowledge, that's where the family, both grandparents were from. I was left with some family business by the patriarch of the Fields family. And I was looking for our family and where the family was buried. And in looking for it, I went back to papers that my cousin had given me, the family patriarch's sons, one of his sons, had given me years ago, where he'd gone to the census and traced the family back to Hector Fields, who was in the 1870 census, and father to son, he was our earliest known ancestor. So, as I'm trying to handle this family business, which is a cemetery where the Fields family is buried in Colleton County, I'm looking for Hector. I turn to the International African American Museum Center for Family History, and the director immediately identified Hector as a Civil War veteran from Beaufort. Well, I did not think we were actually related to him. Because our family is from Colleton County. So the next county over, I said, we don't know those people in Beaufort. I don't know what to tell you. She proceeded to prove that, yes, this was our Hector. So through Hector's pension file and then his brother Jonas's pension file, we learned about our family, and that the family actually was from Beaufort. They were in bondage in Beaufort and must have liberated themselves sometime after the Battle of Port Royal. Hector joined the 2nd South Carolina in March of 1863. And so he fought in the Combahee raid, and was actually, his company was one of the companies that was on the gunboat, the John Adams, that went all the way up the river, stopping at Combahee Ferry. And that's the boat that Harriet Tubman, her spies, scouts, and pilots, Colonel James Montgomery, that's the boat they were on.
Wow. Well, just looking at time and our chat is blowing up. Just for my final question, I was wondering if you could share with us what you hope readers take away upon finishing this really phenomenal work.
Hmm, a lot. I want readers to understand more about slavery and the Civil War and enslaved people's pursuit of freedom,
Mm,
and what in people who were in bondage were willing to, and let me add, people who were in bondage, but people who had also liberated themselves, right? Who were willing to risk everything for other people who were still in bondage. What people were willing to risk and do to secure their freedom and the freedom of others.
mm,
I want readers to understand the power of the Civil War pension files. And it's really through these pension files that I'm able to unlock the stories of these formerly enslaved people. And in the past, pre-Combee, PC, um,
You heard it here first. There you go.
exactly, BC. Um, Historians had the slave narratives and WPA interviews. These were our primary tools for hearing formerly enslaved people's voices.
Mm,
Now, post Combee, we have three. We know that we have the US Civil War pension files, and we have only scratched the surface of hearing what enslaved people have to say through their US Civil War pension files. And if we really dig in, as I hope we will, it's going to cause us to rewrite the history of slavery and the Civil War from the perspectives of the enslaved.
mm.
It will also, and I should say, I reconstructed the Combee community, lower Combee community, using about 175 pension files. There's at least 90,000, okay? 90,000 men got pensions. More than 90,000 actually applied and were denied, like Hector Fields. Hector Fields never got a pension, but he has a small pension file. So there's a lot that we could learn about these enslaved communities from these files. And it's likely that those 90,000 soldiers plus 90,000 plus today have millions of descendants like myself. And so that means that millions of African Americans who are the descendants of US colored troop soldiers could use these files to identify their enslaved ancestors, to hear them tell their stories, and to pass those stories, pass that history down in their families to their children and their grandchildren.
That's amazing. And we have a ton of teachers on our call right now. So I know this information in this book is such a great classroom staple that is easy to use excerpts from. So I encourage everyone to get a copy of it today. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Ryan, who's going to start with our student scholar question of the week.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gina. That was really awesome to listen to. As folks know who are weekly viewers, we always they know that we begin this portion with our student scholar question of the week. But for those who are newer, welcome. And we begin this portion of the program with our student scholar question of the week. So this is a weekly competition in which students have a chance to ask our great guests a question for a chance for themselves and their teacher to win a $50 gift card. we've received questions from students all over the country and world, and they're always excellent questions. And I think this week is no exception. So our winner this week is a student in Union High School in Miss Brubaker's class named Markins. So thank you, Markins. This is a really excellent question. And the question is this for you, Professor. How did Harriet Tubman gain the trust and authority to lead Union officials in a military raid? And what does that say about the military and racial dynamics of the time, according to you?
That's a great question. So many of the commanders who were in the Department of the South were people who were known to Tubman and people who were at some level abolitionists, right? And so this is part of why she is sent to Beaufort and part of why she's sent to the U.S. Army Department of the South. Um, and she's sent by the governor of Massachusetts, John Andrew. So they had history, they had a background. Many of them had been part of Bleeding Kansas back in the 1850s. And we know, for example, that Colonel Higginson as well as Colonel Montgomery were both. Colonel Montgomery was actually on the ground fighting in Bleeding Kansas. And that when General David Hunter, who was also in Kansas, when General David Hunter asks Tubman to go on this mission, she says that she will go if Colonel Montgomery is the commander, right? So it's that connection to Kansas, it's that connection to actually being willing to take up arms to end slavery, right? That kind of brings them all together. It brings them all together. There's a wonderful description, and I'm not going to remember the name of the primary source at this moment. It's fleeting out of my head, but of General David Hunter pouring water from a pitcher, standing up and pouring water for Harriet Tubman, who is seated. So I think that shows some very interesting racial dynamics within this US occupied territory, where you had a small number of Black people, primarily Black women, Tubman, Charlotte Forten, and Susie King Taylor, who are free, and Tubman and Forten coming from the North because Tubman came from the North. And then a large number of people who were formerly enslaved. It was an experiment, right? This was the largest and the first real social experiment in this country's history. And so you have abolitionists, you have who are Black and white, and then you have formerly enslaved people trying to make this free labor economy work. And with that came trying to figure out new racial dynamics.
Wow, fascinating. Great question. As always, keep them coming and great answer. Okay, so many questions in the chat. I'll try to get to as many as possible. They all look excellent. Stephen asked, there's so much about, over the past 10 years, especially about Civil War memory and memorialization. Stephen asks, are there any memorials in Beaufort and the surrounding area to Tubman and to this raid?
Yes, there is at Tabernacle Baptist Church a Harriet Tubman monument that was unveiled for the anniversary of the raid last year, so June 1st last year. And it's beautiful because you see Harriet Tubman in the middle with two 2nd South Carolina volunteer soldiers flanking her, and then they are flanked by the Freedom Seekers. So in Tabernacle Baptist Church, after the raid, they sail back to Beaufort. So June 3rd, when the Freedom Seekers and the boats and the soldiers arrive in Beaufort, they're taken to Tabernacle. And this is where people's needs are assessed. This is where men who are able-bodied are examined for the military. And this is where Harriet Tubman gave a speech. And it was from that speech that 150 men then enlisted in the 2nd South Carolina.
Wow, fascinating. Sam asked if you could talk a little bit about Harriet Tubman's perhaps disabilities or what we know about them and how she handled them. Sam says there seem to be many legends about this. Was it kind of difficult disseminating between legends and evidence as far as perhaps her epilepsy, et cetera? Did you discover anything there or your thoughts about that? Sam would love to know.
Yeah, so it seems that Tubman's epilepsy caused her to have sleeping fits. So fits where she would seem to lose consciousness for periods of time. And this was unexpected, unprompted, um, and something that she lived with for the remainder of her life. uh, the way Tubman saw it, these were times when God was talking to her, right? Where she was receiving direct intervention, direct um, information from God about what path she should take. Um, that's really what we know, right? We have other people's descriptions of Tubman's episodes, and then we have Tubman's descriptions. And there are also periods of her life, there are moments when she's missing, right? So, for example, right before the John Brown raid, after working closely with John Brown, where Tubman does not appear when she is supposed to appear. And so the speculation is that she may have been ill, right? She may have had one of these fits. And or in one of these episodes, she may have received information from God that she wasn't supposed to go in that direction. So there's still a lot to be known about her disability and how it influenced her.
Wow, fascinating. Good question, Sam. Several people in the chat are asking if you could talk a little bit about the Port Royal experiment, what that was, and does that play a role in your book or kind of the larger Tubman story?
Sure. So the Battle of Port Royal took place on November 7th of 1861. And before the U.S. Navy drove its armada of 40 plus state-of-the-art warships up into Port Royal Sound and took out Forts Beauregard and Walker, the planters in Beaufort, Port Royal, and the Sea Islands fled and evacuated. And they were told to evacuate, and they did. And many left behind enslaved people. They left behind the people they held in bondage and the Sea Island cotton that was growing in the fields. Um, they did take some, depending on where they were going. There were some people who were taken at gunpoint. There were some people who were shot and killed because they refused to go. But about 8,000 people were left behind. Those folks were declared by the U.S. Army to be contrabands of war. So they would not be returned to the Confederate slaveholders, but they also were not free. They become free in July of 1862. So it's these folks who the Northern abolitionists come down and open schools, um, running churches, uh, managing the labor on the Sea Island cotton plantations. This is what becomes the Port Royal experiment.
Oh, wow, fascinating. I think really essential for a lot of our teachers to know that. So kind of a follow-up to that question, especially with teachers, as you know, we have so many teachers on the call, so many students on the call. Barbara asked an interesting question. Barbara says, your book is absolutely fascinating, loaded with references. I teach middle school for gifted students. What resources, and particularly primary resources or sources, would you recommend for my students on Tubman, the raid, and perhaps the Civil War as a whole? So a huge question, but your favorite primary sources for teaching.
My favorite primary sources for teaching for Tubman, I would say her autobiographies, which are pretty readily available. And in them, she talks about the raid, she talks about the Civil War. For example, she talks about running with the freedom seekers and helping them carry their goods, pigs, chickens, children, you name it. She talks about what it was like to be on the ground and on the plantations with the freedom seekers. I would also recommend Minus Hamilton's life story can be found in Thomas Wentworth Higginson's Army of a Black Regiment, Army Life in a Black Regiment. There we go. Um, it's in other sources, but that's probably the one that's the most accessible. And I think that, minus Hamilton's account is something that can really just reach students. What else? What else? There are also, of the abolitionists, someone like Charlotte Fortin. Charlotte Fortin kept a diary, and which is published. And so that gets at really the Port Royal experiment and what it was like to be in Beaufort and on the Sea Islands at the time, um, of this social experiment and this racialized experiment, um, after the Battle of Port Royal, from a
Wow, that
teacher who's running schools on St. Helena.
Wow, fascinating. Lots of really amazing resources there. Okay, keeping an eye on time, I'll try to get to a couple more questions. Richard says, thanks so much for this wonderful talk. According to you, or in your opinion, what role did the South Carolina coastal raids, including the topic of this book, play in the overall Union military strategy in the summer of 63? The historical focus has long been on the initiative of Grant's army to win control of the Mississippi and on the efforts to repel the invasion of Pennsylvania. Has that caused the military significance of this raid, do you think, to be kind of overlooked in the grand scheme of the historiography?
I think that's possible. I mean, it's the U.S. Army was definitely operating on in a number of theaters. The summer of 1863 was really the precursor to 1864,
Mhm.
and the retaking of Charleston, I argue, in Combahee. So this was an early shot, right? This was an early morale booster. This was an early attempt in the region for the US Army to get close to Charleston, right? And so retaking Charleston, I'm not arguing that retaking
Hmm.
Charleston is on the table. I'm not arguing that it's yet, part of a plan that, commanders, generals are saying, okay, yes, let's move forward with this. What I'm saying is that morale was low, and the Union was not winning. The Department of the South had been very quiet all, during this period, and there was a lot of grumbling about that. And so getting this close to Charleston was a big morale boost, and sort of catching the Confederacy asleep at the switch was a morale
Mhm.
boost. And it's also part of a string of raids that the US Army and Navy are undertaking, but particularly the Army, with Black soldiers. And so it's almost as if the Black soldiers of the 2nd South Carolina were the secret weapon, right? That the US Army could conduct these raids in this low country region during the sickly season, when the Confederacy had removed its troops and they wouldn't return until the end of November. Um, and they can do it because they have been enlisting Black men. So it's kind of an exploration on what can we do, and can we operate in this region, right? And can we even imagine that we could retake Charleston.
Wow, fascinating. Apologies if you already discussed this with Gina. I can't exactly remember if so, but Donald asks an interesting question. Were any of the Tubman's raids officially documented by the War Department and recognized at the time or later by the U.S. government? And if so, to what extent?
Uh, I would say no, they were not documented at the time. One of Tubman's scouts, spies, one of the men in her ring was named Walter Plowden. And Plowden is actually pensioned for his work as a spy and a scout, whereas Tubman is not. And in Plowden's pension file, there are letters from, I believe it's the War Department, that say, yes, he was actually engaged in these spy missions, one of which is the Combahee River raid, and others, a few others of which were reconnaissance missions on the Combahee before the raid. That's really the only official recognition of the raid. You do have Colonel James Montgomery's report, which is a one paragraph report. It's not published in the official military record. And in the official military record, what is published about the raid, the reports that are given about the raid, are from the Confederate officers and a few Confederate soldiers. So in the official military record, the perspective of the raid is coming from the Confederacy, really, and it's them trying to explain themselves. How did this happen? Right? And these were my orders, and this was my position, and this is the other person who was actually at fault for the Union coming up the river. You don't get the Union perspective, you don't get Tubman's perspective at all in the official military record.
Wow, fascinating. Again, I'll try to get to a couple more questions. Vincent, I think, asked an interesting one. In your research, did you come across the expectations of Harriet or others that she led to freedom regarding post-war Reconstruction plans, particularly with regard to freedmen? An interesting, large question, I think.
Yes. No. Well, the only thing that I can think of, there was one of the officers of the Second South Carolina who wrote a memoir, and in it he talked about on certain plantations like Cypress Plantation, Cypress is destroyed in the raid. However, the freedom seekers and the soldiers did not burn the slave cabins. And he says that Colonel Montgomery told them not to burn the slave cabins because after the war, they would belong to them. So that's the only thing that I can think of about what people thought was going to happen after the war. It's very clear from the testimony and the pension files, primarily by the wives whose husbands liberated in the raid and joined the Second South Carolina the day after the raid, that they were going to war, that their husbands, when they got on the boat, their husbands were going to war, and that they were going to war against slavery. They don't talk about what comes next.
Wow, fascinating. Nicole asked an interesting question. This is such a involved, huge research process for your book, that is, I'm sure. But are there any details that you uncovered in your research that you were not able to include in your book? Anything that you left out that perhaps you wish you left in? Any interesting
Yeah,
nuggets? Always
there
interesting
are,
to ask authors that question.
yeah, there's always things that have to be left out. Um, I have a wonderful editor, Tim Bent of Oxford University Press Trade Division, and Tim said over and over and over again that we are not going to cut out any of the slave material. And we got to a point where I said, okay, Tim, you're not going to cut it, but I'm going to cut it. We have to do something. So there were people who I couldn't trace. I wanted to know if okay, the main characters are the people who remember the raid. And then I wanted to be able to trace them before the raid, during the raid, after the raid. So inevitably, there are people who I couldn't trace. And at some point, I had to trim their stories out of the book. If not, the book would be 1,000 pages. um, it was like looking for needles in haystacks, and trying to find the same needle in 3 different haystacks. There were plenty times where I couldn't find it. So that's number one. That's probably the biggest. Um, hmm, anything else as a body? I would say that's the biggest body of material that didn't make it into the book.
Wow, fascinating. I have to ask a couple of people in the chat are asking, have you seen this particular raid portrayed in any kind of media portrayals or anything that you think is really a great source or on Tubman as far as that you would recommend for teachers on the small or big screen, anything like that? It's such a fascinating part of history. I mean, I see so many people in the chat saying, make this a Netflix mini series or something like that. Does something like that exist to your knowledge?
To my knowledge, no. There is, I believe, a drunk history
Someone mentioned that
episode.
actually in the chat. Yes.
Yeah,
And
about
they said it's quite well done.
yeah, yes, it is. Um, there's a portrayal of the Second South Carolina in glory, which
Also mentioned.
I do not think is good. Um, and in the Harriet biopic, I believe it came out in 2019.
Mhm.
One of the last few scenes in that film are about the Combahee raid, and I don't think that's particularly good either. So I think there's a lot of room for something new.
Yes, absolutely. You said your lips, as they say. Yeah, I think that's what our audience is saying too. And then I suppose a nice accumulating question before I throw things back to Gina for some final thoughts is just as mentioned, several times before, so many teachers on this call, so many students, and really students who are really interested in history, and same for teachers as well. And they would love to use this book in the classroom, as a teaching tool. Do you have any really great chapters that you think would
Yeah.
be awesome for teachers, or how do you think? I'm sure our teachers' ears perked up. How do you think that they could use this in their history courses, their civics courses going forward? And again, one last plug, but there's links in the chat to get your hands on this great book, and we really encourage everyone to do so.
I think that chapters 13 and 14 are a really good segment. Chapter 13, you have Joshua Nichols, who is who was he it's a long story, but he lived on Long Brow Plantation, married, it was the widower of the owner of Long Brow Plantation. And so he describes what happened to him the morning of the raid as he was asleep on this rice plantation. Um, and then you have Minus Hamilton in chapter 14 giving his perspective, right? And so these 2 chapters back to back, I think are really a good to get 2 different sides of the raid from 2 of the main characters, one black, one white, one slaveholding, one enslaved. I think are good teaching tools.
Absolutely. Well, we encourage everyone to get your hands on this book. Okay, I'm going to throw things back to Gina again, as I always say. Well, not always say, but in this case, certainly fits the bill. So many more questions that we had time for. Get your hands on this book, and all your answers can be found there, and we encourage everyone to do so. So sorry if I didn't get to your question, Gina. Back to you for some.
Yes, thank you, Professor. This was such a fantastic talk today. And as Ryan mentioned, if you want to get a copy of the book, if you use our link, you can get a copy of the book through the bookshop, and a portion of the proceeds go to us. And if you would join us next week, we're going to be joined by the author of Angelica for Love and Country in a Time of Revolution, Molly Beer. And you can go to gilderlehrman.org for historical documents, History Now essays, the Hamilton Education Program, and so much more. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor. It was a true honor to have you.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
All right, everyone, have a great day.